Today on Drive Through History, you're going to drive and walk with me through some of the most important historical locations in Boston and Newburyport, Massachusetts. We will walk the famous Freedom Trail that cuts through downtown Boston, but we will start this episode not in America, but on a train just outside of Gloucester, England, where I visited the birthplace of one of the most famous and influential men of colonial America. Prior to the American Revolution, America began to develop its spiritual independence from a more traditional European view of Christianity. And there appeared in the width and breadth of the colonies an enormous surge of a new kind of religious expression. It was called the Great Awakening. We're on our way to the city of Gloucester here in England to look at the hometown of the father of that movement, a passionate, itinerant English preacher named George Whitefield. George Whitefield was born right here at the Bell Inn, here in Gloucester, England, December 16, 1714. George grew up here, a boisterous and theatrical kid with a love of acting and theater, a talent that would later serve him well in his ministry because he liked to act out Bible stories in his sermons. When George Whitefield was 12 years old, he was sent to grammar school in that building here at St. Mary's of the Crypt. He had a record of truancy and ended up dropping out at age 15 to help his mother working over in the inn. It was during those years where he would sit up late at night reading the Bible that a desire to preach was birthed inside of him. Well, we're here. This is the church that George Whitefield got his start in, St. Mary's of the Crypt. You guys are hearing that too, right? Weird. After graduating from Oxford, the Bishop of Gloucester ordained George Whitefield to the Anglican Church, despite the fact that he was well below the canonical age, the age you were expected to reach before you were considered mature enough for formal ministry. Immediately, George Whitefield leapt into his chosen profession, preaching his very first sermon right here from this very pulpit. It was obvious that young George Whitefield had a special gift, and this unassuming young man from a small town in England was about to leap onto the world stage. Over the next several decades, Whitefield would travel to America 7 times, making a total of 13 transatlantic voyages. Now keep in mind, this was back in a day when making such a voyage was a long and perilous adventure. Whitefield had a knack for connecting with almost any audience, and he was tenacious in his pursuit of souls, sometimes preaching open-air sermons in front of churches that refused to admit him. Burly men would weep like babies when he preached. Ladies would swoon in religious ecstasy, and sometimes people would even convulse on the ground. The First Great Awakening is a name given to the period of time when new Christian movements were highly active in the American colonies. Whitefield helped light a fire that became a revival, sweeping across the American colonies. This new personal expression of faith was a powerful change, and it further distanced many of the American people from the Anglican Church, the official state church of England. With faith becoming separated from government in the minds of a large number of Americans, the seeds of independence would be sown from American church pulpits for the next 30 to 40 years. George Whitefield spent most of his adult life in America and preached over 18,000 formal sermons. In the process of faithfully sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ to Americans, Whitefield became a beloved figure and was buried where he had ministered to so many. I'm here at the Old South First Presbyterian Church, right here in beautiful Newburyport, Massachusetts. Whitefield's funeral was held here October 2nd, 1770, at the Old South First Presbyterian Church. It was so well attended that thousands of people couldn't even reach the doors. In fact, memorial services were held for him all over the nation. And it's beneath the pulpit of this church that Whitefield's remains are buried. Now, you can still come here to pay your respects to George Whitefield, but this site has been a site of pilgrimage for many years. Well, ever since he died. In fact, people would sometimes take little bits of clothing and even bones from his body. In fact, in modern times, church officials have been working to bring all those pieces back together. Actually, they're still missing a piece, a thumb bone. Now, inside of this crypt lie the remains of George Whitefield. It's an actual cast of his skull. He's buried in here with the very first pastor of this church, along with a close ministerial colleague. The impact of the life and death of George Whitefield on colonial America often goes unmentioned in modern history books. But one famous preacher who followed said this: "Often as I have read his life," wrote C.H. Spurgeon, "I am conscious of a distinct quickening whenever I turn to it. He lived. Other men seem to be only half alive. But Whitefield was all life, fire, wing, force. My own model, if I may have such a thing, under the due subordination of my Lord, is George Whitefield. But with unequal footsteps must I follow in his glorious path."
Next, it was time to leave Newburyport, cruise south to Boston, park the Jeep, and put on my walking shoes. If you go to Boston, no doubt you'll want to visit the Freedom Trail. The Freedom Trail is a pathway that links some of the most frequently visited historic sites in Beantown. Notice I said most. There are some amazing places in the region that are not on the Freedom Trail, simply because they were not within close walking distance. I hope you've got some comfortable walking shoes, because we're going to hit all the sites on Boston's Freedom Trail on drive, or should I say walk, through history. Boston Common is the first stop on the Freedom Trail. You may want to pick up a guidebook here.
You ever follow one of those lines at a hospital that guides you along a path and takes you to your final destination without a lot of complicated directions? Well, that's the idea behind the Freedom Trail, originating right here in Boston Commons. Only with the Freedom Trail, it's a red brick pathway. The important part, of course, is to remember, always stay on the path. Yeah, I know. I just was checking the trees. This 50-acre oasis is America's oldest public park, dating all the way back to 1654. It was originally used as grazing land for cattle owned by Boston farmers, and later for gatherings, such as public executions. Mary Dreyer, a Quaker, was hanged here in 1660. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had a law banning Quakers who defied the law. Mary Dreyer is considered to be the only woman in the history of the United States to ever die for religious freedom. The British Army camped out right here just before the start of the Revolutionary War. From here, they departed to Lexington and Concord for what would be the first hostilities of the War for Independence.
It's hard to miss the gleaming gold dome of the State House as you exit Boston Common. Boston is the capital of Massachusetts, and the State House is the second stop on the Freedom Trail. The Massachusetts State House is an architectural masterpiece designed by Charles Bulfinch and completed in 1798. Charles Bulfinch was a fine early American architect and regarded by many as the first native-born American to practice architecture as a profession. He also designed the original rotunda and dome of the U.S. Capitol.
Charles Bulfinch's works are a study in simplicity, balance, and good taste. And he started the federal style that became so popular in the 19th century. He studied at the Boston Latin School and Harvard. After graduation, he went on a grand tour of Europe. It was there that Thomas Jefferson became something of a mentor to him.
Following the red line downhill from the State House, you can't miss the 217-foot steeple of Park Street Church.
The church, active to this day with a thriving congregation, was built back in 1809. The Park Street Church has a long and proud tradition of evangelical doctrine, missions, and the application of Scripture to social issues. In fact, important anti-slavery speeches were delivered right here during its early history.
Right next door to Park Street Church is Granary Burial Ground. There's something about old cemeteries that I really like. It just fires up my imagination.
Founded way back in 1660, the Granary Burial Ground on Tremont Street in Boston is the city's third oldest cemetery, serving as the final resting place to many of America's most loved and admired patriots of the Revolution, including 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence: John Hancock, Robert Treat Paine, and Samuel Adams. The victims of the Boston Massacre are also buried here. And don't miss this simple memorial to the revolutionary hero, Paul Revere. Just another example of the many humble and simple stone markers that commemorate the lives and deaths of so many of our country's finest men and greatest heroes. When you come here, make sure you leave enough time to really stop and consider the legacy that these men have left us.
Further down the path is King's Chapel, a 1754 church designed by Peter Harrison and known for its Georgian interior. A Unitarian church today, it is open daily in the summer. Look for a statue of Benjamin Franklin welcoming you to the next stop on the Freedom Trail. Boston Latin School opened in 1635 and was the nation's first public school. While the Boston Latin School is still in existence, it is no longer at this site. Today, it's a restaurant. Hungry yet? You soon will be. Boston's Old Corner Bookstore is one of the oldest structures in the entire city of Boston, having been erected in 1712 by Thomas Creese.
Now, this building was typical of the kinds of dwellings and shops that lined the streets of Boston during colonial days. Note the distinctive gambrel roof. Now, a gambrel roof is a symmetrical 2-sloped roof, which gave the benefit of a sloped roof with additional headspace on the top level. Now, the word comes from the medieval Latin word gamba, which means hoof or leg of an animal. No doubt you've seen many barns with roofs like this in your day. Fortunately, this building was preserved and restored in 1970.
In the mid-1800s, a publishing house owned this building, and it was something of a hangout for literary giants like Charles Dickens, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Henry David Thoreau. You've got to check it out.
Completed in 1729, the Old South Meeting House was the largest building in colonial Boston, which made it a natural gathering place for the colonists as they grew increasingly weary of English rule. It gained fame as the organizing point for the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, when 5,000 colonists gathered right here. Famous congregation members included Samuel Adams, Ben Franklin, and William Dawes, who accompanied Paul Revere on his famous midnight ride.
As our tour continues, we visit Boston's Old State House. Now, this building served as the first headquarters for the British government in Boston. Built in 1713, it is the oldest surviving public building in Boston and the seat of the first elected legislature in the New World. In 1761, James Otis argued against the writs of assistance in the Royal Council chamber. A writ of assistance was kind of a search warrant on steroids, and the colonists hated them because the power was frequently abused. Though losing the case, Otis's speech was one of the events which led to the American Revolution. The Fourth Amendment of our Constitution outlaws writs of assistance.
After the American Revolution, this building served as the seat of Massachusetts Commonwealth government from 1830 to 1841. This beautiful building is an architectural treasure and a study unto itself. The lion and unicorn are a symbol of the royal coat of arms and used to remind the colonists of the royalty and supremacy of the king. Today, They're reminders that we no longer have a king because we told him to take a hike. Right in front of the old State House is a cobblestone circle right here on this traffic island in front of the east side of the old State House. This rather unceremonious traffic island marks the spot where the British killed 5 colonists on March 5th, 1770, in an event that later became known as the Boston Massacre.
An engraving of the event was drawn by Paul Revere and printed in newspapers and pamphlets. This incident helped spark the revolution. Faneuil Hall, aka Faneuil Hall, is located adjacent to the Faneuil Hall Marketplace, also known as Quincy Market.
This really is a beautiful building. It was built in 1742 by a Boston merchant by the name of Peter Faneuil and later remodeled by Charles Bulfinch, who we looked at earlier. It was the site of many famous and passionate anti-British protests, including speeches made by Samuel Adams and James Otis and others who were encouraging an independence from Great Britain. Today it's part of the Boston National Historical Park and is sometimes known as the Cradle of Liberty.
Faneuil Hall is a premier example of Georgian architecture. Georgian describes architectural styles built between 1720 and 1840 and named after 4 British kings named, you guessed it, George. Georgian architecture is characterized by its beautiful proportion and balance. Here we see simple mathematical ratios that were used to determine the height of a window in relation to its width. This style was widespread in the English colonies of the time. An Americanized version of this style later became known as the Federal building style.
During the Revolutionary War, a secret password was often required of many colonial soldiers. When asked the question, "What sits atop Faneuil Hall?" the reply better be, "Why, a grasshopper." Of course.
Quincy Market is a great place to stop for a refreshment break during your 2.5-mile walk along the Freedom Trail. The indoor-outdoor market is home to dozens of restaurants and food vendors. The next stop on the Freedom Trail is the home of the famous midnight rider Paul Revere. Here, American patriot and silversmith Paul Revere lived from 1770 to 1800.
The house was originally built in 1680, and at over 325 years old, it's the oldest surviving building in downtown Boston. Now, if you come here, prepare for some time travel. You can walk where Paul Revere walked and touch what he touched. It's really a cool place. It'll really fire your imagination. I mean, how many of our houses are going to be around in 2335? This is the Old North Church, dating back to 1723. In its day, it was the tallest building in the entire city of Boston, making it the perfect signal tower. And while it was technically the King's Church, it was here that Robert Newman lit 2 lanterns to alert Paul Revere and others that the British were arriving by sea. And the rest, as they say, it's history. History. The rest, as they say, is history.
As we continue our virtual tour of the Freedom Trail in Boston, we look back at the tower of the Old North Church and imagine Paul Revere urgently looking up to see that church steeple. A visit to Boston really brings the history you learned in school to life. The Freedom Trail continues to wind its way through the north end of Boston. The next stop is Copp's Hill Burial Ground, a cemetery located high above the city on a hill that was used as a vantage point by the British during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Many local merchants and artisans are buried here.
In fact, Robert Newman, who lit the 2 lanterns on top of the Old North Church, is also buried here, along with many local merchants and artisans from early Boston. And another important detail is the fact that it's said that some British soldiers actually used some of these tombstones for target practice. Scoundrels.
The Freedom Trail leads right here, the USS Constitution.
The USS Constitution is a wooden-hulled, three-masted Navy frigate built here in Boston by an order signed by George Washington himself. It was launched in 1797 and is today the oldest commissioned warship that's still afloat. Now, it was nicknamed Old Ironsides back in the War of 1812 because of the British cannonballs that seemed to harmlessly bounce off the southern live oak sides. Now, free guided tours are offered daily, so you want to get here early because lines form. Because this boat with such an illustrious history is recognized now as a true national treasure. Corpsman, medic, Howie. There are 56 guns on this ship. Now imagine the noise and chaos in this room alone during the heat of battle. Here's some authentic cannonballs. This way might be better. Why do I want to say things like, "Arr, Captain Jack Sparrow"? We're down below in the USS Constitution, and this is the captain's quarters, where he slept. And this was his own personal bathroom. Talk about a room with a view. Check it out. Woo! That's strange. A lint box. I wonder how many belly buttons that came out of. Actually, I'm gonna make a contribution. There we go.
A 221-foot granite obelisk marks the site of the first formal battle of the American Revolution, the Battle of Bunker Hill. This battle was technically in the W column for the British, because they took the hill. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers were lost.
It was right here that the British learned that they weren't exactly fighting a bunch of peasants with pitchforks. The British hold on Boston was short-lived after the arrival of George Washington. And this monument behind me, erected back in 1843, commemorates the Battle of Bunker Hill. And if you're in the mood for some pretty sweet views of Boston, climb the tower steps if you have any energy left, because this is the final stop on Boston's Freedom Trail.
Well, that's it for the Boston Freedom Trail. You've got to see it for yourself. When in Boston, you might want to check out Dorchester Heights, the location of America's first major victory against the British. It was a long day of hoofing it around. My plans for the next day included Lexington and Concord, so I decided to set up camp at a Minuteman campground. With the adventure trailer and a little help from my friends, I knew I'd soon be ready for a home-cooked meal over an open fire. It was time to kick back and enjoy the good life. One of the many benefits of being your humble host.
And there's nothing like that old-time American campfire classic pizza. Few people realize that you can give day-old pizza a second chance by reheating it over an open wood fire. And a little fresh cheese. Let's get that nice and warm, just like Mom used to make. Needs more cheese. More cheese. This one's got the cheese built right in. Or does it need more?
More cheese.
And no campfire is complete without roasted marshmallows. They were out of the big ones. Ow! Ow!
Get out of my way.
Anybody got any hand sanitizer? Totally smells like gunpowder down here. Hope this thing doesn't spring a leak. And for more drive-through history, check out our entire 12-part Drive-Through History America series, including Boston and Beginnings. And if you're in the mood to go old school, check out the Drive-Through History programs on ancient Rome, Greece, and Asia Minor, the other Holy Land. I'm Dave Stotts, and drive safe.